But I would just like to have at least the mayor or something on the stage. So is UCFG taking care of getting their people? Otherwise, we can start. I mean, we are very late already, but how do you feel? Are you comfortable to start already, to kick it off?
It's just about the minister, protocol about the minister.
But we'll take her whenever she comes in,
Yeah.
I think.
It's your call, Gina.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to kick off this particular session, special session on the future of biodiversity. I'm very, very pleased to have part of our panelists already here. Others are joining in a moment. My name is Gino van Begen. I'm the Secretary General of ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. We work with around 1,700 cities and regions also around the world, in particular on sustainable development issues, including also biodiversity. And this particular session today will build on and further enrich actually national and regional discussions that we have organized twice in Beijing, in Brussels, today here and in other places further. The outcomes of all these consultations will feed directly into the biodiversity preparations and the COP in particular that will, from the Convention on Biodiversity, that will take place amongst the parties in Kunming in China in next year, 2020. As far as ICLE is concerned, we have been committed to promoting the role of local and subnational governments in the conservation and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems since many years now, actually more than 15 years. We had set up 15 years ago a program which we call LAB, the Local Action for Biodiversity Program, via which we supported biodiversity planning and action in more than 50 cities around the world. Later on, we have been working on launching and actually recently launched a new international platform that we call the Cities with Nature platform. It was done with the support of Germany, the Federal Ministry for Environment, with ICLE, the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and Nature Conservancy. Cities with Nature has been, as a platform, been officially recognized by the CBD Secretariat, which as a platform for local and regional governments to report their actions, their commitments on biodiversity and on nature-based solutions as we move on. Now, next year, parties will come together in Kunming, as I just said, in China, to discuss and hopefully agree on a 10-year strategy for biodiversity, and that should bring us to halting the loss of biodiversity as we see it happening today. From our perspective and from the panelists here on the scene, this is an important international gathering and movement, and we think it is very important that cities and regional governments do bring in their part as well as their voices into the discussions with nations, because halting biodiversity and restoring biodiversity as well as building upon nature and its services for sustainable development is absolutely essential at the local and regional government. We believe strongly that it is almost impossible for nations to actually agree and therefore also afterwards implement new targets, new strategies related to biodiversity on a planetary basis if other levels of government are not strongly involved both in the discussions and later on in the implementation. So I think with that, in terms of a introduction, I would just like the panelists also to think about two major questions that I feel are important to address here. First of all, the biodiversity crisis that we are seeing here is not just an environmental crisis. This is a crisis around development at all and at large. The rapid biodiversity losses that we are seeing and we are witnessing are actually undermining the development gains that we have had and achieved so far. So that's point one. Point two is it is clear that our future and the planetary future is an urban one, and that to address the double crisis of climate at the one hand and biodiversity at the other hand, the world and the international community needs other levels of government to come in, be it at city level or at regional level, because that is where the majority of the population is living and will continue to live and actually increase. So we should remember that both cities and regions are hubs of innovation and solution, and that they can and must therefore also be leveraged and brought into those discussions. So having said that, I am very pleased to welcome Mrs. Marie Daigle de la Fontaine, who is our international relations advisor and at the Office of International Relations at the City of Montreal. And I should say that the mayor of Montreal, Mrs. Valérie Plante, is actually ICLEI's ambassador for biodiversity, and she has been with us at a number of those consultation meetings, and the latest one was in New York at the Climate Summit in September upon invitation of the Secretary General of the United Nations. So, Marie, maybe if I can ask you how you, from a city perspective in particular, how do you address politically the issues of biodiversity, as to why is this important to Montreal in your particular case, but also how do you bring it into your policies and decision making within the city? And Marie, maybe just also for our participants here in the room, I think you may be talking in French, so then I would advise you to take some headsets, or otherwise we follow you in French. Please, go ahead, Marie.
Thank you. La biodiversity.
Biodiversity is something very important for the future of the planet. As the IPBES said, there are million species are menaced with extinction, and the situation is getting worse and worse. It has an effect on nature and on humans because it's the main safety net for the survival of the human race. Biodiversity is also linked to climate change. So climate change causes biodiversity as the ecosystems are not able to adapt fast enough. As you were saying, 50% of people who live in cities, so urbanization brings a very heavy pressure on biodiversity. The level of mineralization of the soils reduces the ecosystems and has impacts on the quality of the soil for agriculture and the quality of the air that we breathe. And the cities where there's the least biodiversity are cities where there are less parks. And as we know, places where there are less parks are the place where most vulnerable people live. In Montreal, we decided to take this question very seriously. And so the mayor was elected because of her commitment to make districts which are inclusive, resilient and pleasant and with a human dimension. So nature in the city has a very important role to play. So we're setting up measures that favor biodiversity, promote biodiversity, to fight against climate change, and for the quality of life of our citizens. Here are a few general examples. We're very proud that we've planted trees in our cities, especially of varied species, in order to have a 25% vegetable cover. It's very important to reproduce plants because the extinction rate is 1,000 times higher than the normal rate. We also have a program for managing the big parks ecosystems, where we want to protect the species and still give access to the public. As to great parks, one of the big initiatives that the mayor took was the creation of a huge park in the west of Montreal, which will be one of the biggest urban spaces, parklands, in the whole of Canada. And we mustn't be worried about the options that we took to carry out such a project. We stopped a real estate project for this reason. Parks are the lungs of the city, and they need to be protected, and green spaces have to be protected. So, as I was saying, Montreal is very active on the local scene, but biodiversity is a world problem. So the mayor decided to invest on the international scene, because it's very important for biodiversity. She's going to join COP15, which will take place in China. And the Convention on Biodiversity is a very important event where participants will be asked to commit to have a world framework for biodiversity. So the mayor accepted the invitation to become an ambassador for the cities on the question of biodiversity and to ramp up for COP15. She's the global ambassador for local biodiversity. Montreal also has the secretary of the United States, for the United Nations for biodiversity. As an ambassador, the mayor wants to invite other towns to take collective action on this very important question and to fight against the climate change crisis, which can have a lot of importance in the area of biodiversity. We hope to, with all the delegations that are here for COP15, which should be not only a progress for biodiversity but also for humanity. Thank you very much, Marie.
I may come back to you with some clarification questions, and if that is okay, but I would like to give first the floor to the rest of our panelists, and then maybe we have a short time to come back on some of the points that you elaborated in Montreal. Thank you very much. May I now just move to Mrs. Sarah Kupka, who is our Climate Change and Adaptation Policy Officer excuse me, at Regions 4. Regions 4 is the network for regions, in particular on sustainable development. So, yes, we would be very much willing to hear from you how you, as a network, think to work and bring regions into connection with nature. Please, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Gino, and also thank you very much to UCLG for inviting us here. First of all, I would like to stress why subnational governments, as we say in the CVD terms, are important alongside the local governments in the cities. There are several reasons for this. First of all, because they have certain responsibilities and competences in areas that are key for integrating biodiversity, such as environmental protection, territorial planning, land use planning and landscape management, but also infrastructure investment, economic development, education, research and innovation, and water and waste management, among others. Of course, I mean, this depends on the country and the context. Second, they have a key position between the national and the local level. So this allows for developing subnational biodiversity strategies and action plans that are in line with the respective national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and also in turn also support the development of local biodiversity strategies and action plans. So this ensures vertical integration and coherence of all levels of government's action, and it avoids the crucial policy gaps between local action plans and the national policy frameworks. So the decentralized efforts help nations to reach their targets while also serving as testing grounds to evaluate strategies and implementation techniques. Then the subnational governments' actions and policies, they match with the CBD principles to the specific context. So subnational governments possess the tools they need to match the principles of biodiversity protection as defined by the CBD at their own levels and in accordance with their own powers and resources. So this allows for successfully incorporating biological diversity at sectoral and intersectoral levels. For example, strategies for the sustainable use of forests or food security for indigenous communities. And subnational governments are able to establish crucial partnerships with the private sector, indigenous communities, civil society, and other stakeholders. So they play a crucial role, which is also actually acknowledged by the CBD and its parties, also together, of course, with the cities and the local governments. The parties to the CBD acknowledged this by adopting the 2011 to 2020 Plan of Action on Subnational Governments, cities and other local authorities, which will end next year. So we will, as you said, next year is the important COP where we'll hopefully discuss also the future of this issue, but I will come to this a little bit afterwards. What we are doing as Regions 4 is that we are actually coordinating the advisory committee of subnational governments and biodiversity within the CBD. It was established in 2010 and is officially recognized by the CBD. And since 2017, Regions 4 is coordinating is now together with the government of Quebec. And as a operational partner, the Regions 4 Biodiversity Learning Platform is part of this. So the learning platform is an initiative by the Regions 4 where regional governments come together to learn from each other, to find solutions to common problems, but also to very specific problems in their regions. So it's a lot of knowledge exchange and peer-to-peer learning. And this also, by having this, it contributes to the whole biodiversity agenda and the process. So now coming to next year and shaping the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, of course, we, as the coordinators of the advisory committee, have some recommendations for the parties and the CBD. We have several ones, actually. We would like to recommend that the importance of vertical mainstreaming and cooperation with subnational governments as partners of the parties to the convention is considered. It should support other framework, like the biodiversity framework that is hopefully going to be developed. Should support other frameworks and agendas which have a direct bearing on biodiversity in particular, and as we heard, the 2030 agenda, but also the Paris Agreement on climate change. I mean, these whole global agendas, they are all connected and should not be regarded in silos. So it needs an integrated approach among all of them. Sorry. Also, we recommend that the parties commit to encourage and support subnational governments to develop their own tools, strategies, and action plans in line also, and align them with the national plans, and then also work together with the locals. Also to consider the importance of having global sources of technical cooperation, financial resources, and tools oriented to subnational government action needs and characteristics as critical in the implementation of the CBD. Further, we suggest that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the parties support a renewed, expanded, and updated version of the Plan of Action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities for biodiversity, and enhance the parties' support to the advisory committees. Further, we think that the processes for developing and implementing the post-2020 agenda must be well understood and clear to all, and should generate a broad support by all stakeholders, of course, including the different levels of government in this. And the structure should include the role and contribution of subnational governments, recognizing their role because recognizing their role would allow for a better integration of conservation measures by local authorities and organizations, and this could be, for example, accomplished in the preamble. Well, this is a very concrete suggestion. And our last recommendation is that the advisory committee obtains an official status in the negotiations under the CBD, which would respond to the need of an institutional structure for subnational governments. Last, I would like to mention our contribution to this year's SubStar, which will, I think, happen in 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. We will bring a report on mainstreaming biodiversity from the subnational government's perspective, and we will present how subnational governments contribute to the transformative changes needed. It will also provide information on the importance of linking the different levels of governments and the actions needed to mainstream biodiversity in different sectors, and explore the potential of subnational governments and advance solutions and ideas to overcome obstacles to mainstream biodiversity. We will address mainly 4 main themes. First, capacity building and training needs for mainstreaming biodiversity, opportunities to develop and strengthen partnerships, a mechanism to monitor the implementation of actions to advance the mainstreaming of biodiversity, and last, obstacles that block mainstreaming of biodiversity in regulation processes, policies, and programs. So with this, I end my presentation here. We are really glad that we have such strong partners also on the local side within the CBD, and we are looking forward to work further on a common agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much for your presentation, and in particular for the your demands from Region 4 to the nations in these discussions. I'm fully aware that ICLEI and Regions 4, but also with other networks, we are in a duty to bring those topics to the parties, and very happy to work with you on that. I have a couple of comments and questions, but maybe if you allow, I would like to go to our next presenter and then come back on an overall discussion, if that is okay. So next in line, I would like to present Mrs. Kobe Brandt, and Kobe is our Regional Director of ICLEI Africa and the Director of ICLEI's Global Cities Biodiversity Center. And Kobe, you are surely now for ICLEI, but as it was just said also with our partners here on the stage, working towards drafting a roadmap for local and subnational governments, and how we want to bring our positions to Kunming in China, ultimately to not only make a good statement, but to get us on a better way in terms of biodiversity and halting the losses of biodiversity we are seeing. I think your how would I say, message and advice is very much that local governments, regional governments, subnational governments for that purpose have a very big task on the ground to advance us here. So if I may just ask you, Kobe, to bring us through the common roadmap for local and subnational governments towards Kunming. Please, Kobe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gina, and also to my fellow panelists here. I can hear a lot of commonality in terms of what we as different constituencies and also under the leadership of Mayor Valérie Plante, who's really taking up this global ambassadorial role for us, want to achieve. And next year truly is a big year. It is a very big year for local and subnational governments. There's a lot of action planned, and we'll go a little bit into that, but certainly for the world. I think it is very important that we understand the impact of this year, 2020, and COP15, which is the CBD Convention on Local Biodiversity, COP equivalent of the climate COPs. So as ICLEI is the convener of and the focal point recognized by the United Nations for the climate space to convene the voice of local and subnational governments into the climate processes, we are also recognized as the convener for local and subnational governments by the CBD into the biodiversity space. So it's a big duty and responsibility that is bestowed upon ICLEI to not only look into the interest of the membership that we have, which spans from quite small towns to very, very large subnational governments, but also to go beyond our own membership constituency and serve the collective voice of all local and subnational governments and make sure that that voice is collectively heard and articulated very well ahead of, during, and after the decision that will be reached in Kunming. Because ultimately the decision that will come out of COP15 will set the world on a new course in terms of how people engage with nature and the planet we live on. So if I could get the slide cursor, then I will move us along. Just to, as a first introduction, and I think it's been some of this has been mentioned before by my speakers ahead of me, so I will go quite fast through these. But it is important to understand that life itself is nature. And another way to describe the big word biodiversity is simply to think of it as the web of life. And that web of life is ultimately so connected in ways that we are only beginning to understand. New science tells us that trees, for instance, and in fact all plants in a forest actually communicate with each other in a language we don't understand yet. But underground, there is a network of communication channels between living organisms, which just astounds us. And the science that is coming out of how nature connects with us in ways that we do not even understand yet is just astounding. But what is very clear these days is that our health and well-being fundamentally is linked to the nature that is surrounding us. These plants in front of us have right now a positive effect on our intricacies in our brains. That has been proven by science, by the medical world, and by the people who work on human health and well-being, both at the cultural, the spiritual, and the physical dimension of our minds and of our beings. So ultimately, I think that connect is deeper than we sometimes recognize, and sometimes what we see in cities is that people are losing that connection with nature. There are many people who do not make the connection to the food that they eat and bring that back to nature. For instance, we buy eggs and produce and fast food in ways and consume that in ways that we do not connect back to nature. And I think we've interacted with nature in ways that have been not as respectful as it should have been, and science, mainly through the IPBES 7 report that came out earlier, a few months ago, we have now seen that we are in the new age of massive extinction of species. And this age is called the Anthropocene. And the science has also indicated to us that this Anthropocene, which is another mass extinction of nature, unprecedented in the way that we connect to it, is ultimately caused by people, by us. We are causing this mass extinction. So all life on Earth is and will always depend on healthy ecosystems and is part of nature. So nature also often provides free services to cities, and I think we've heard from the city of Montreal how they recognize the cost savings and the many benefits that nature brings to the urban life, to the urban dimension. If we use our nature-based solutions, our wetlands, our parks, our green open spaces, in ways to provide services like flood retention, etc., we will actually be saving on municipal costs. And when we talk about such savings, mayors listen, because mayors and their city managers have to work within budgets, and they have to save money to effectively provide services. And if they can get these services for free from healthy ecosystems, it makes sense to invest in nature in and around our cities. So we cannot look only at the city level, we have certainly need to look at the city region level and at a landscape level when we look at nature-based solutions and services. I want to give the example quickly here of Cape Town, the city I'm coming from. Our water does not come from the city itself. It comes from the surrounding area, the provincial area, the subnational area. And there had to be very, very intense trade-offs between these different levels of government. For instance, the agricultural sector had to take phenomenal water cuts in order to make sure that the city of Cape Town didn't run dry. So this connection between the different levels of government is absolutely fundamental when we address nature as well. And then we've got to realize that nature is a fundamental link for us to addressing other global agendas, namely climate change, all the SDGs, we would argue, and many other global development challenges we're facing. I'm not expecting you to read this map. This comes from the World Economic Forum's latest risk report, but it is very clear that over the past couple of risk reports, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse has been always one of the top 10 global risks. And in fact, many of the other risks are directly or indirectly related to this possibility of ecosystem collapse and the tipping points we hear of at some stages. The urban sanctuary, for us it's an opportunity because we are building infrastructure at an unprecedented rate. We are building and shaping and reshaping our cities constantly. In Africa, the explosion